Okay, so what we're going to talk about is language as an act of love in action. And so you may be wondering, why do we need to learn words as part of acting in love? Some things to be mindful of. The words that Tracy and I are going to talk through represent people and the ways that we self identify. We show one another love and respect when we honor the ways that each of us wants to be known. We probably know from our own life experiences that the words we use have a great impact on people. They not only demonstrate who we are when we use words to identify ourselves, but the words we use also impact how other people see themselves. Do the words that we use honor the presence of God in every single human being? The words that we use have the power to honor God and honor the creation of each of us in the image of God, but they also have the power to do great harm. And so we need to be mindful of the ways that the words we use impact how folks see themselves. The other thing is that language is always changing over time. And so sometimes we use the same words and we mean different things. So when we are having discussions, particularly those related to, for the purpose of this workshop, LGBTQIA2S plus folks, it's important that we know what words we are using and what we mean when we say them. As I've already said, our words have the power to help people feel included and affirmed or excluded and judged. And so as we enter into this time, we would just ask that we would all be mindful of the importance of being gracious toward one another and toward ourselves as we continue on this journey. We are all always learning and growing. And the truth is, sometimes we make mistakes with regard to the language that we use. And so we just ask that you would enter into this time with a spirit of graciousness and openness to maybe learn new things. So what I'm going to start with is talking about sex. So generally, sex refers to biological characteristics. This can include body parts, chromosomes, hormones, that which is often happening internally from a biological perspective. Typically, our Western culture has assumed that there were only two sexes, male and female. What we have seen over the time through developments in science is that this is not always the case. So what I'm going to do is just talk about some of the common terms that are related to sex and add a note about the use of the biological indicator. So generally, the terms that we hear related to sex are male and female, which I think many of us can define on our own, and also intersex. So folks who are intersex are typically born with ambiguous genitalia or bodies that appear neither typically male nor female. Historically, intersex folks have been referred to as hermaphrodites. You may still hear this phrase used, but it's important as we honor the ways that language is evolving, that this is a term that can be offensive to folks who identify as intersex. And so we do not want to refer to folks as hermaphrodites. Oh, my last bullet didn't make it in. I apologize. Well, I'll just add the note anyway. So when we talk about sex, sometimes folks refer to the phrase biological sex or the phrase sex as assigned at birth. We want to move away from using the phrase biological sex and move toward using sex as assigned at birth, because all of us have biological characteristics regarding our sex. But what sex as assigned at birth does is it indicates that it was in fact something that was assigned to us, typically a doctor when we were born, beyond our control. And so we honor that it was something that we did not necessarily have a say in, and that allows us to move forward with our identity over time. So Tracy Merrick, are you unmuted?
I am unmuted. I think I'm fine. Thank you. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm Tracy Merrick, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. As we proceed through a number of these terms that we're going to be talking about this morning, I hope it's important for us to notice that all these terms apply to all of us: sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, sexual behavior, and we all have pronouns. These are not terms that apply to other folks. So let's talk about gender identity for a moment. This is basically how a person feels inside about who they are, whether they're feminine, masculine, neither, or both. Some terms that are often used in respect to gender identity are things such as cisgender. A cisgender person is someone whose sex as assigned at birth and gender identity match. I am a cisgender male. Transgender or trans. A transgender or trans person is someone whose sex as assigned at birth and gender identity are not a match. It's important not to use the term transgendered. We're talking transgender. A trans person may or may not take steps to alter their biological characteristics. This can take many forms. It is not one singular path that all trans folks take. Some decide to have surgery, some decide to make the adjustments in their lives hormonally, or just by how they present themselves, or a combination. Another term that I think is important for us to know about more and more today is the term two-spirit. It specifically relates to Native Americans who identify as male and female. And this is a deeply, deeply spiritual aspect of Native American traditions. Queer or genderqueer. This is an umbrella term. As you may or may not know, queer has been a term that's been seen as a very negative one. But as time has progressed, folks who have begun to adopt queer as a terminology that they will use for themselves. I would just bounce back for 1 second and mention that the term transgender or trans is an adjective. Okay, just so you all are aware of that. So let's move on and talk about pronouns for a second. The use of pronouns and the right pronouns is very, very important. In case you don't know what pronoun a person uses, ask them, and they'll tell you what pronoun they want to use. But it's important once we do that we use that pronoun, and because that affirms the person. If you happen to make a mistake, as many of us do, and use the wrong pronoun, apologize and move on. We all know that language changes over time, and it is important as time progresses that we honor the diverse use of pronouns in our midst. It's a very simple act of hospitality and respect. So what are some of the common pronouns? Well, we all know she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, their. Those three pronouns have been used in a plural sense for a lot of years, but we're finding that more individuals are choosing as individuals to use the pronouns they, them, their. And by the way, there are some other sets of pronouns. If you are so inclined, you might Google neopronouns and learn more about what some of those others might be. In case, like me, you've had problems with the verbs associated with they, them, their, when they, them, their is used singularly. I was looking that up this week and found in a dictionary something that was very helpful. We all know that you is both an individual pronoun, singular and plural. And so when we're talking about using that pronoun you, we say you are nice, whether we're talking to an individual or a group of people. So when we're using the pronoun they singularly, the analogy would be to use the plural verb. They are nice as a group, or they are nice as an individual. That may be helpful. I hope it is. And the folks who, there are many people who use they, them, their as individuals. Many of them are binary or gender fluid folks. So let's move on and talk about gender expression. We talked about gender identity. That is how people feel inside, how they feel about themselves. Gender expression is how a person shows up in public. They can be using that different clothing, accessories, language, behavior, and a multitude of other different ways. Some common terms related to gender expression: male masculine, female feminine, non-binary. This refers to individuals who identify as neither man or woman, both man and woman, or a combination of woman and man. Gender fluid describes a person who does not consistently identify with one fixed gender, or who may move between gender identities. And gender queer has some of the same connotations. But let me just give a couple of comments about this. Gender expression can be culturally specific and changes over time. I will never forget an evening where I was attending a seminar offered by trans folks. And in the course of that evening, an individual stood up and said, "I don't see myself represented in this panel." And the moderator said, "Well, what do you mean?" And the person said, "I am gender fluid." And this person went on to describe that some days that person felt like presenting as female, other times presenting as male, and sometimes neither. We need to understand this is part of people's realities. It may be a little bit of a stretch for some of us, but it's important for us to recognize this. And we all know that there are different cultures, such as folks who live men who live in Scotland and Pacific Islanders who wear apparel that include kilts and so forth. And we have in our society today people who would call themselves cross-dressers. So it's important for us to understand that gender expression takes many forms, and it is part of the reality of who folks are.
Thank you, Tracy. Before we move to sexual orientation, I do also want to add to your point, Tracy, that, as we're going through this, of course, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page about words. And so some of this language in reality can feel compartmentalized, but of course, how a person identifies and expresses is far more nuanced, that things don't always fit neatly in these little boxes that we would like them to. So as we offer these terms and some examples, please just be mindful that part of the human existence is that life can be messy and not so neat and compartmentalized. And so that is true in the ways that we identify and express ourselves throughout our lives. So on that said, I'm going to move to talk about sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is generally what happens inside of our hearts. Who am I romantically attracted to? Who do I fall in love with? Who do I want to make a home or a family with? Some common terms you will hear related to sexual orientation are heterosexual or heteroromantic. So those are folks who are attracted to people of a different sex than theirs. The term gay is typically used for men who are attracted to men, but it can also be used for women who are attracted to women. The term lesbian is typically used for women attracted to women. And so you will notice just in these first few terms that we use the terms gay and lesbian, not homosexual. Now, we know that this is a term that the United Methodist Church likes to throw around. It is in our Book of Discipline. It is, quite frankly, the term that we are probably arguing about the most these days. But using the term homosexual can be offensive to folks who identify as gay and lesbian. And so I offer that for us to be mindful of the words that we are using when we are talking to and about folks. And I also offer that because I think it is really important to recognize the harm that our words are doing in the midst of conversations in a church that is still using such hurtful language. So that said, bisexual or biromantic, you will also often hear this shortened to simply be bi. And so those are folks who are attracted to folks of the same gender or sex and people who are of the opposite gender or sex. Pansexual or panromantic, you may also hear this shortened to just simply be pan. And so these are folks who are attracted to others along the whole spectrum of gender. Asexual or aromantic are folks who may not be attracted in sexual or romantic ways to anyone. And then as we've talked about queer as kind of an umbrella term, this term can also be used within sexual orientation. So some folks may simply identify as queer because they don't fit neatly into any one of these categories. For many, it is also just the umbrella term that can encompass all of these orientations. And so I think the important thing to note about referring to someone as queer is that we always want to ask folks how they identify and then honor whatever term it is they use. So if they choose to identify as queer, we certainly want to use that term and honor them. But there are folks who are gay who may not want to be referred to as queer. And so we always want to be asking and honoring whatever that language is that we hear folks use. So before we get into sexual behavior, it's important for us to recognize that every single individual has a sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation before we even get to talking about sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is what we do with those identities, right? How do we express our sexuality? And so often with regard to sexual behavior, this is where we start to look at things like ethics, what is right and what is wrong, power dynamics, who has power and who doesn't, consent, mutuality, and generally just personal preferences. As a church, we have put some parameters around what might be acceptable or healthy behavior. But all the church language aside, the truth is that sexual behavior is positive and healthy when it is consensual, mutual, and pleasurable. So we always want to make sure we are honoring each individual's autonomy, our choices and the choices of others when we are expressing our sexuality. And then sexual behavior is wrong and harmful when it is abusive, coerced, non-consensual, or exploitative. As a church, we have added our own parameters, like I said, around what kind of behavior is wrong and harmful. And unfortunately, as a church, I think this has come out of our fear of that which some of which we don't understand. That when we don't understand it, we automatically assume that it is wrong or harmful. And so we seek to control folks who make us uncomfortable. So with regard to the expression of our sexuality and the behavior that we are engaging in, I would always encourage us to be mindful of when we're looking at, what might be more positive or more negative. The questions that we always want to be asking are, is there consent? Is there mutuality? Does whatever we are doing feel good to us? Not necessarily only focusing on, are we comfortable or uncomfortable about this behavior? So some common terms related to sexual behavior. Celibate, so this is someone who does not have any sexual partners. Monogamous behavior is behavior with a single partner. And polyamorous, non-monogamous, that all refers to folks who are engaged in sexual behavior with multiple partners. Go ahead, Tracy.
I would like to take a couple of minutes to talk about the LGBTQIA2S+ acronym. It has taken many forms over many years and will continue to change as we learn more about folks and how they self-identify. It's really important that we honor the fact that folks who are These letters represent people, and people who are self-identifying in varying ways or have or express helps understand their experiences. So let's not use the term alphabet soup as it relates to this series of letters. I would also like to amplify what Donnie said earlier. Individuals do not necessarily fit into these particular categories singularly. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. I think based on what we've already described to you, we've talked about most of these. We've not lifted up questioning. And Q in this acronym has taken a number of different forms over the years. Both queer and questioning have been incorporated into this Q for a number of years. I would like to indicate also that this is, folks think about a spectrum of human sexuality, with heterosexual as being on one end and something else on the other. I hope you've understood as a result of our conversation here that this is so incredibly multidimensional that it's not just a single spectrum. Human sexuality is a beautiful, multidimensional gift from God, and we need to understand that in that way. Let me just give you an example of the wonderful, beautiful complexities of all of this. I'll never forget attending the very first seminar that I attended. My wife and I attended actually on transgender people. We walked in the room and met some of the most incredible people. One individual was speaking and indicated that that particular person's journey had begun as a male, and that woman, now woman, was going through a transition. And before, as a male, that person had been in love with a female. As a result of the transition this person was going through, that person was now a female in love with a female. And I'm just sharing that so that you understand that there are multi-dimensions to this, and it's just important to recognize that. So let's move on. We have some suggestions that we wanted to provide for our churches as communities of faith. First, we ask that people would be willing to ask individuals what pronouns they want to use. We also think it's important for us as individuals to use the pronouns that we use. And you'll notice that some of us have put on our screens the pronouns that we use, not just in public settings like this, but in communications and emails and so forth. This gives other people permission to use their pronouns openly. We also mentioned earlier that we don't want to see us using LGBTQIA2S+ as alphabet soup. A helpful hint for all of our congregations is that we should provide at least one gender-neutral restroom in each of our buildings. This helps folks feel more welcome who might not feel comfortable going into a male or female restroom, or for folks who are male or female sharing a restroom. Please avoid non-binary language. It's important for us to migrate from using statements such as men and women and brothers and sisters, and instead use people, folks, friends, siblings, colleagues. This is more inclusive and less binary language. It's important for us to listen to people share their stories and to avoid the tendency to make judgments or to correct them. Let's affirm people's calls to ministry and ordination, people of all gender identities, expressions, sexual orientations, and marital statuses. It's important for us to affirm healthy relationships and marriages of people with all gender identities, expressions, sexual orientations, and marital statuses in a non-controlling way. And let's be advocates by graciously pointing out language and practices as we encounter them, which intentionally or unintentionally exclude LGBTQIA2S people. So let's move on to some expressions of community. There's a lot of confusion in church circles about communities of faith. And the expressions I'm about to go through are not mutually exclusive. This is a list I developed. I take responsibility for it in over an hour in the last couple of days. It's not perfect. I will probably make changes to it as we go forward. But let's just think about these sorts of concepts. There are many, 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 many churches who would say they're welcoming and they gladly receive all people who come. But there are also communities that are affirming. They respect, embrace, and support all people for who they are and provide settings for all people to be authentically who they are within the life of the community of faith. There are congregations which are advocating communities. They proactively urge equitable practices, policies, and regulations which support all people in organizational, governmental, institutional, and public spheres. There are those churches that are fully inclusive. They provide opportunities for full participation in all aspects of a church life and in all roles open to laity and clergy. And there are some churches which would claim to be welcoming, which are probably tolerating. They allow people to come, but limit their participation. And it's certainly possible for a church to be more than one of these. But let me just share a story with you that I think is really important for us to bear in mind as we think about this. I was speaking with a lay leader of one of our churches a couple of years ago, and this lay leader said, our church is really a welcoming community, and we have some lesbian folks who worship with us. And I said, oh, that's great. And I said, are they open, is the church open to allowing them to be liturgists and to sing in the choir and to lead groups? Oh, no. We welcome them. They can come and worship with us, but we don't have an openness to their participating fully in the life of the congregation, as you've just cited. Are they able to sit together and worship? Oh, yes, they can sit together, but they shouldn't hold hands and they shouldn't look at each other lovingly. Okay. And so you get the message. That congregation sees itself as welcoming, but to LGBTQIA2S plus folks, that is probably not a congregation that they would consider to be welcoming. So let's think about what this means as we think about our own communities of faith. And as you will talk with some of our friends and colleagues who are LGBTQIA2S plus, they may have an opinion about whether a church is actually a welcoming community, an affirming community, an advocating community, or a fully inclusive community. So we'll be glad to pose for answer any questions you may have for a couple of moments here. I will share by in closing that I can't speak for Anais, but I can speak for myself. If there's a setting in which you would like to have someone come and present this sort of information, I am very open to assisting with that. But so let's see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. And I would just, before we move to questions, just affirm the importance of the connection between the words that we use and the expressions of community that we embrace. That often our language is a great indicator of where we're at on that spectrum of tolerating to, welcoming to inclusive to fully inclusive. Yes, thank you, Kelly, for just naming in the chat, ridding ourselves of this use of brothers and sisters. I know for many of us, this was once an inclusive term We hear it not just in liturgies and in greetings, right? But also in music. We did not even talk when we were talking about language and practical applications for worship. The ways that the language in the hymns and the praise songs and whatever other kind of music that we choose to sing as a community, that has a huge impact on the messages we send about who is and is not welcome in our spaces as well. Yes, so we see siblings. There's a question in the chat. I don't know that everybody gets these questions, so I'll say them out loud as we answer them. We see the term sibling used as a non-binary option rather than brothers and sisters. So that is a great example of a term that might be used. Okay, so I see a question in the chat about the term transsexual. That is generally not a term that we want to use. Tracy, you can also offer any thoughts you have about that, but my experience of that term is that it's actually been a combining of two different ways of identifying. And so that is not in any way an affirming or supportive term. Yeah, Carly.
I can take that one. So transsexual has fallen out of favor because, as was noted earlier in the presentation, you don't necessarily have to go through medical procedures such as surgeries or hormones. And transsexual has generally been used to refer to those type of people. And that can leave out people who have not gone through them and invalidates the fact that they are trans. So we generally try to avoid using transsexual, and that is why the umbrella term transgender is used instead.
Awesome. Thank you, Carly. We also saw from Helen, who will be a panelist and is on staff with RMN nationally, is that some folks do choose to use brothers, sisters, and siblings all as one kind of all-encompassing greeting to honor that whole spectrum. Let me see here. I apologize as I'm going through to make sure we don't miss any of these. And then the last thing that we see that, Tracy, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this. I'll read the question. I've been also answering them all. From a couple of folks is a challenge of the use of family, that for many, family has not been a place of love, affirmation, and support. And so that term can be triggering to some.
So I thank the person for raising that. I think that's really an important consideration. Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. And I think there are some opportunities in there to reimagine what family looks like as we are modeling healthy and supportive communities. But we also have to hold that with the tension of the potential for a triggering or harmful experience for a person where family has not been a healthy or supportive experience. So with that, we thank you all for your attention. As Tracy said, we're always happy to come and talk to congregations, to answer questions more in depth. Obviously, this was very much a scratching the surface, just sharing some terms. And so if there were questions that you would like to discuss more in depth, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. If there are things you would like for us to come and connect with your congregation about, we are always happy to do so.